All right. Hi, folks. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dave Esslinger. I'm the current advisor, which is the immediate past president for the Coastal Master Naturalists. I'm excited here in this October to be learning about bats, night wanderers, learn about the obscure lives of bats from Lydia Moore, who is a research and education manager for the Palmetto Bluff Conservancy. And she has been fascinated with conservation and ecology since she was a child growing up near Salt Marsh here in Charleston. And she went to Oberlin College for a double major in biology and environmental studies. Spent a few years working for various nonprofits, including the National Wildlife Federation, the Peregrine Fund, that's one I like to support, and the Turner Endangered Species Fund. And after spending some time with that work in New Mexico, she returned to get a master's degree at Auburn University studying bats in the coastal plain of South Carolina. So she's a community ecologist with a focus on bat conservation. And she is currently working at Palmetto Bluff Conservancy, where she oversees the environmental education programs and the ecological research initiatives. So with that introduction, I'd ask everybody stay on mute until the end, and you can type questions in chat if you think you're going to forget them. And I will turn control over to Lydia. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for having me. This is a somewhat informal talk, so if y'all have questions at any time, feel free to ask. I also have some audience participation parts, so you can type answers in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and holler out and answer whichever one you feel best about. But today we are talking about night wanderers. So we're going to talk a little bit about general bat biology before focusing on bats worldwide, and then we'll narrow it down to bats of the low country, talk a little bit about a super depressing topic, which is threats bats are facing, and we'll end it uplifting with, all the things that you can do to help them. All right, so before we launch into it, I just want to direct your attention to the title of the talk, Night Wanderers, and that is an allusion to the scientific name of the bat that you see on your screen. This is a silver-haired bat. It's a bat we have in South Carolina on the coast in the winter, so it is migratory. We don't have them here in the summer. And the scientific name is Lasionicterus noctivigans. So Lasionicterus just means hairy bat. That's a bat that roosts out like in the canopy of trees. It's relatively exposed to the elements, so it has really thick fur to be able to have that thermal insulation. But noctivigans means night wanderer. Noct like night, vigans like vagrant. And I just think that that name perfectly captures the mystery that surrounds these really elusive mammals. All right, so let's launch into it. Let's talk about Chiroptera morphology. Can you see the next slide that says Chiroptera more? Okay, cool. So Chiroptera morphology is just a way that relates form or anatomy and function, which is how we interact with our environment. So if you look at the diagram that you see here on the right side of your screen, you can see that humans, birds, and bats, we have what are called homologous limbs, which mean that we have basically the same bones. They just look really different because we interact with our environment very differently. So for example, the purple would be our humerus in all three of these groups. And then the yellow are the metacarpals. So those are our hand bones, and the orange are our finger bones. You can see what those look like in birds. And then again, what they look like in bats. So bats belong to the order Chiroptera, which just means hand wing. Chiro is like chiral, like hand, ptera, like pterodactyl wing. And that's basically just saying that these bats have wings that are essentially skin that stretch between elongated hand and finger bones. So really, really fascinating. So chiroptera morphology, we interact very differently. They fly, we walk, so we have very different looking hand, arm, and bones. So very, very cool there. So bats, oh, this picture on the left, I just wanted to point it out. This is a Seminole bat. We caught this guy at Palmetto Bluff a few years ago. So you can see these bones here are their really long hand bones. This is its little thumb. And then this long bone here is this tiny bone in us. You can see blood vessels, like that's a blood vessel right there. And there are, sometimes you'll see holes in the wings. This is a hole, maybe it got stuck on a branch or something, just like when we skin our knees, it scabs over and then our skin grows back. It's the same thing with their wings. This one was already healing when we caught it. It was a little bit hardened around the edge. Eventually it'll just close up and it's like that hole never happened. So bats are the only flying mammal, the only truly flying mammal. And you might think, Lydia, what about flying squirrels? They have flying in the name. But do flying squirrels fly? Here you can just shout it out or type it in the chat.
No, they glide.
Excellent. Hi, Christina. No, they glide. They
Hello.
glide, right? So they have an extra flap of skin between their wrists and their ankles that help them glide. Their tail is flat. It acts like a rudder. So they're gliding. They're not actually flying. So bats are the only mammal capable of true flapping flight. And flight is very energetically costly. Bats have a really fast metabolism, a voracious appetite, and we're going to return to that concept throughout the talk. All right, so bats are the only truly flying mammal. And there is a lot of difference, a lot of variation, diversity in their wing morphology, which is basically what their wings look like. And here is where I like to compare bat flight, which is something that we usually don't get to see, to bird flight, which all of us have been able to casually observe. So you may have seen a bird hop up from the ground, land in a tree branch, or fly from the tree branch to a bush, hop around inside that bush, go from that bush to another bush or the ground or whatever, right? So for birds, their destination is a place to land, generally, making a broad generalization. It's not really true for swallows, but most of the time, these birds are going from destination to destination, and that aerial space is just their highway to get there, okay? For bats, bats don't fly like that. So when they leave their roost at dusk, they're not landing in a bunch of different places. For them, their destination is that aerial space. So they may land occasionally throughout the night to digest food, or if they're a mom, they'll go back and nurse their pup, but they're on the wing for a really long time. So they're flying around bushes or around a tree, something like that. Very few bats can take off directly from the ground. Mostly they have to drop to fly. Vampire bats are one of the exceptions. They can take off directly from the ground, but they have kind of a weird anatomy that lets them do that. But most bats are not capable of doing that. So birds and bats fly very, very differently. The fact that bats are on the wing so much means that their wing shape or their wing morphology is very, very important. And what it comes down to, it's like when you look at a wing, you can kind of guess how that bat is flying, which will also indicate where it is flying. So it's going to come down to a couple of different things. How big is that bat relative, or how big is that wing relative to the size of the bat? And that's just saying, how much weight does it have to carry? And then the other thing you're looking at is the shape. Are they long and narrow, often with a somewhat pointed tip? Or are they short and broad, often with a rounded tip? So these short, broad wings, like these two right here, these are going to be bats that are relatively slow flyers, but they are really maneuverable. So they can cut and dive around vegetation. They fly in areas that have a little bit more clutter. And in the bat world, we use the word clutter to mean anything that a bat can fly into or that would produce an echo. So it's usually like shrubs and trees and buildings and things like that. So these guys are going to be flying probably below the tree canopy. within forests, in areas that are maybe riparian areas where there's a lot of little trees kind of, all together. So they basically traded speed for maneuverability. These guys did the opposite. They are not very agile, can't cut and dive around vegetation. So they're usually flying above the tree canopy or over like an open field or something like that. But boy, are they fast. They're incredibly fast flyers, not very agile, but very, very fast. In fact, the fastest flying animal on the planet is a bat. And y'all may be thinking that cannot possibly be true because you know that peregrine falcons exist. And they can reach speeds at about just shy of 190 miles per hour. But are they flying when they reach those speeds? Y'all can just shout it out. Are peregrine falcons flying when they reach those speeds?
No, there's
Diving.
They're diving. Those cheaters are using gravity to their advantage. So yeah, they're not really flying when they're reaching those speeds. They're diving. But the Brazilian freetail, so named because its tail is free of its tail membrane. Most of our bats here have the tail membrane that goes all the way down to the tip of the tail. We actually do have this species in South Carolina.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but like I've been doing the the bat monitoring with the wildlife acoustics, and we get these Mexican free-tailed bats or Brazilian free-tailed bats right in our backyard. And it's so exciting that they are here in South Carolina and they are super fast.
Yeah, so yeah, they're really common in South Carolina. We have a subspecies here. So you've got the Brazilian freetails is the species. In the southeast, we have LeConte's freetail, which is Tidarda brasiliensis cynocephala, which means dog-headed, just their face looks like a dog. And then out west, they have the Mexican freetails, which are Tidarda brasiliensis mexicana. So they're very different behaviors. Like our bats, our freetails don't live in giant colonies, and we'll talk about that in a second. And they don't fly long of distances as the Mexican freetails do. Mexican freetails can fly 60 kilometers in a night, over a mile high in the air, like above ground. They're really incredible.
Wow.
But those Mexican freetails, sustained flapping flight, are just shy of 100 miles per hour. Sustained flapping flight. That's really impressive. Fastest flying animal on the planet. Really, really cool. So we just talked about flight, which is not unique to bats, but is one of the distinguishing characteristics of bats. Let's talk about another distinguishing characteristic of bats. It's also not unique to them, but is one of the major qualities that they have. And that is echolocation. So this is another process that bats do that is really energetically costly. So they have flight and they have echolocation, very energetically costly. So the general process of echolocation is the bat is flying around and it is emitting sound waves, which are denoted by these blue lines. Those sound waves go out away from the bat, hits an object, in this case, a nice juicy moth. And then the echo, the orange lines, return to the bat. And then the bat can kind of see a soundscape based on things like how long did it take that echo to return to them? What was the angle of the echo? How fractured was the echo? That sort of thing. Okay, so there is an issue with echolocation. These sound waves do not travel indefinitely. At some point, they dissipate or attenuate in the atmosphere. And for the sound waves to be effective for the bat, they have to hit an object and return to the bat before they attenuate. So bats compensate for this by having by being really, really loud is one of the ways that they compensate for this. And there are some researchers in Panama that wanted to quantify the amplitude or loudness of bat calls, and they measured the amplitude of the calls 10 centimeters from the bats' mouths. And they found that the bats were emitting calls at 140 decibels, which doesn't really mean anything to me because I don't know the decibel scale, but I'll give you some context. The point where it becomes uncomfortable for us to hear and damaging to our ears is 120 decibels. and bats are emitting calls at 140. So you may be wondering, if they're so loud, why can't we hear them? And that's an excellent question. The other way that bats handle that sound attenuation issue is by having ultrasonic sound. So really high frequency sound above our range of hearing tends to travel farther before it dissipates. So bats echolocate, which we can't see the sound and we can't hear it, but we can record them. And we can turn that sound into something that we can see, and that is called a sonogram. So I just want to orient you here in this sonogram. On the x-axis, we have time. This is 1/4 of a second. There's a lot going on here. On the y-axis, we have frequency in kilohertz. The point where we stop really being able to hear is about 20 kilohertz. So this line right here, we can hear some things like clicks and some high-pitched sounds around that area, but we can't hear the full spectrum of the noises that these bats are making. Okay, so I like to pause here and make another comparison with birds. Okay, birds have songs. Songs have very clear beginnings and very clear ends. Bats also have songs. They do a lot of social communication. They're incredibly social creatures. But echolocation is not a song. It's a call. And there's no clear beginning and no clear end. They're just constantly making noise, essentially. So to kind of see what this looks like, to walk you through what's going on here, a bat is flying around and it's emitting what are called search phase calls. So that's these pulses here. And I want you to think of every one of these pulses as information. Okay, every pulse the bat's going to emit, the echo will return to them that gives them information. Okay, so search phase calls, they're emitting these sound waves, these search phase calls at regular intervals, pretty widely spaced apart. Then they've detected something they're interested in. Maybe it's a nice juicy moth. They start to emit approach phase calls, which have ticked up in frequency, but have also gotten a little bit closer together. So they're getting more information in the same amount of time. And if they really want to home in on something, they'll emit what's called a feeding buzz. Look at how much information that bat is getting in the same amount of time. Really, really incredible. And then hopefully it caught it. Maybe it didn't, but it'll go back to emitting these search phase calls. And it's going to do that over and over and over again, pretty much all night. So echolocation, not a song, but it is a call that is giving bats information about their environment. So I have a video here that I hope you can hear. And it is a bat. This is a big brown bat that we processed a couple years ago. It's a female. And what it is emitting is not echolocation. It's emitting a distress call. Unfortunately, when we handle bats, we are freaking them out. So they are highly stressed, definitely not enjoying the process. We try to do it very, very quickly, but they're frequently emitting these high-pitched distress calls, and we can hear a little bit about it, a little bit of that call. So let's see if you can hear it. Maybe. Yeah, so we can hear a little bit of that call. We tend to lose the ability to hear high frequencies first. So if you weren't able to hear it, don't worry about it. But that's basically the part of their calls that we can see. So we talked earlier about wing morphology and how you can guess a little bit about how and where a bat flies. We can look at characteristics of bat faces and guess a little bit about how they echolocate. So we're going to talk about nose leaves and ears. So nose leaves are projections off of bat noses. So all 4 of these bats on the left-hand side of your screen belong to the same family, Philostomidae. These are the leaf-nosed bats, philo like leaf-nosed bats. It's the most diverse family of bats worldwide. They're only found in the Americas, not found anywhere else, and they all have these little leaf noses. They look very, very different from each other. This guy over here is in the horseshoe bat family, Rhinolophidae, rhino like nose. This is an old world species. They are not at all closely related, but it also has that leaf nose. So what's going on there? Well, some bats are emitting the echolocation calls through their mouths, and some emit them through their nose. And in order for the bat to get a lot of information from those sound waves, there has to be some form of directionality, right? So think about our vision. For our vision, our greatest visual acuity or focus is straight ahead because we have binocular vision. That's how our brain can then interpret how we're seeing things. So what is straight ahead of us, we also have some peripheral vision, right? Bats have the same thing with sound. So they have greatest focus in one direction, and they have peripheral sound too. So these nose leaves are providing a way to get that directionality. So for these guys, you can emit that these are emitting echolocation through their nose. For these guys here, they don't have those nose leaves, but you can see on this free-tailed bat, they have a lot of wrinkles around their lips. And they're actually using their lips like a megaphone. So they're basically getting the same thing, which is directionality, but we can guess that these guys are mouth emitters and these guys are nose emitters. Okay. I also want to point out the ears. So all of the ears have crazy features like wrinkles, all sorts of little wrinkles in them, which we're not really going to talk about, but all of that's related to echolocation. I just want to focus on size. So we mentioned earlier that bats are really loud so that they can get the most out of that returning echo, right? But not all bats are loud. Not all bats are that loud, I should say. So the ears act as a way to amplify the returning echo. So if you're really, really loud, you don't need to compensate for anything. You're going to get that loud echo coming back to you. But if you're more of a quieter bat, then you do need to compensate for that returning echo being really soft by having enormous ears to amplify those sound waves. So like this Honduran white bat is probably a pretty loud bat. Look how tiny those ears are. Oh my goodness, look at the bubblegum pink ears of this spotted bat. This is a bat we have in the Western United States. Absolutely incredible. We have a couple of big-eared bats here. There's actually well, there used to be a colony of Raffinesque's big-eared bats at Kaw-Kaw. I'm not sure if it's still there, but that's a state endangered species. That's a species of conservation need. So really, really incredible. But we have lots of different big-eared bats in the United States, and they're nicknamed whispering bats because their calls are of such low amplitude that, like, even if you have a bat detector, you're probably not going to record them unless they're flying right next to your detector. And then this guy, which I think looks like the rabbit mask from Donnie Darko. This is a California leaf-nosed bat. So they're probably somewhere in the middle. They're not super quiet. They're not really, really loud. Like this guy, they're somewhere in the middle. They're kind of like a medium bat, medium loudness. So another bit of audience participation. I haven't said anything about this guy in the upper right corner. What do y'all notice about this bat?
I think he looks cute. He's got little ears though.
Little
Big
ears.
eyes, big
Cute.
eyes.
Big eyes. Excellent. What about its nose?
Big nose, like he's looking for fruit.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Big nose. So mammals that have a long rostrum nose, that generally indicates they have a pretty good sense of smell. This is a bat that is, this whole family, these are the flying foxes. They are old world fruit bats. They eat fruits and get nectar and pollen from flowers. So they're going after very aromatic items for food. So they have an excellent sense of smell. Fruit does not give up much chase, so they don't really need to have echolocation capabilities. Their ancestor from this group lost the ability to echolocate. There are 3 species that independently re-evolved it, and they use tongue clicks. All of these other bats use their larynx, which is how we talk. But those flying foxes that can echolocate use tongue clicks, which is, we're not going to talk about that. But they also don't have any of those special features with their ears, like a tragus that has it, which is this right here, and it's this on us. They don't have a projection like that. They don't have Their eyes are enormous because they have excellent vision. All of these other bats have okay vision. They can see at least as well as we can in the dark. And some of them can see ultraviolet light, which we cannot see, but this guy has excellent vision. So not all bats echolocate, just pretty crazy. And that's this one family, the flying foxes, that most of them don't. All right, so these are just eight bats, 8 species of bats from all over the world. They all look very, very different. So you can guess that this is a pretty diverse group. It is the second most species-rich group of mammal, second only to rodents. There are about 1,400 species worldwide. They're found on every continent except Antarctica. And on several oceanic islands, the only native mammal is a bat. So for example, on Hawaii, the only native mammal is the subspecies of hoary bat, which is the Hawaiian hoary bat. And we actually have hoary bats here in South Carolina. We have 47 species-ish in the United States, 15 here in South Carolina. There's a huge diversity in size. So this is it's in the Philippines, a golden crown flying fox. I was blanking on it. So golden crown flying fox, its wingspan is 6 feet long. I am like 5'3"-ish. So this bat's wingspan is longer than I am tall, which is pretty crazy, but they're eating fruit. It weighs in a whopping 2.5 pounds, so it's still pretty lightweight. They do not have hollow bones, but they do have pretty light bones. On the other end of the spectrum, this is the Kitti's hognose bat in Thailand. That is a full-grown adult coming in at a whopping 2.5 grams. A penny weighs 2 grams, or sorry, it's weighing in at 2 grams. A penny weighs 2.5. So this bat weighs less than a penny. Our bats here range between like 6 to 30 grams. So it's much smaller than our bats. And I have this diagram in the bottom right just to remind myself to say that bats are not rodents. A lot of people think that bats are rodents, but they are not evolutionarily related. They're not very closely related. They have very different life history strategies. So rodents are relatively short-lived. They're lucky if they can live to be a year old, but they reproduce copiously. So they're very short lifespan. They'll have multiple litters with multiple pups in each litter. Bats took a different tack. So they are relatively long-lived for being such a small mammal. Most small mammals don't live very long, but there are bats that can live over 45 years old. We have a bat in South Carolina, not on the coast, but in South Carolina that's been documented at 30 years old, and that's a little brown bat. So relatively long-lived, and they have a very slow reproductive rate, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But most bats have 1 pup a year. There are some that can have twins or triplets, but most bats only have 1 pup a year. So very, very slow reproductive rate. Most bats worldwide, 70% of bats worldwide are insectivorous, but for the 30% that are not eating insects, they're eating a huge diversity of other things. So there are some bats that are primarily frugivores, they're going after fruit. They're really important in seed dispersal in the tropics, especially reseeding areas that have been fragmented. So they're really, really important in that procedure. There are bats that are going after nectar or pollen. They're really important in providing pollination services. There are bats like this bulldog bat in Central America that trawls for fish. So it's actually echolocating and detecting fish just below the surface of the water, and then uses these really long toes to catch those fish. So they're primarily eating fish. There are 3 species that eat blood. We have none of them in the United States. Only one of them really likes mammals. The other 2 are particularly fond of birds. Then there are some species that are strict carnivores. This is a fringe-lipped bat, also in Central and South America, and they really like frogs and salamanders and things like that. And then there are a couple of species. This is a false vampire bat in Australia, but there's another one in the spectral bat, also in Central and South America, that are strict carnivores. They're going after birds and rodents and shrews and other small mammals, and they'll even eat other bats. So huge diversity in what they'll eat. and a huge diversity in where they live and who they live with. So we think about bats in caves, but have you realized how many bats are roosting in a cave together and how tightly packed they are? We'll come back to that topic when we talk about diseases. There are some bats that prefer their own company. This is an Indiana bat in the United States that is roosting by itself underneath some exfoliating bark. There are some species that like to be in cavities in trees, either by themselves or in colonies. There are some bats like these Honduran white bats in Costa Rica. I was just fortunate enough to see some last month in Costa Rica, and it just kind of blew my mind. But they make their own roosts. They'll kind of nip the edges of a leaf, and that leaf kind of folds over, and they tuck themselves underneath it. So they're roosting in tents. They're called tent-making bats. There are some species that roost in the foliage of trees, so just exposed to the elements out in the open. We have several species that do that here, holding onto pine cones and pine needles and that sort of thing. And then there are some that have really unique roosts, like this woolly bat in Malaysia. It's roosting in a pitcher plant. How incredible is that? So huge diversity in what bats eat, where they live, who they live with. So you can imagine that all of this diversity means that bats are really important ecologically. They're also really important economically. So we're going to talk about two ecosystem services that bats provide us. And an ecosystem service is just a service that benefits us that we can quantify the value of. And it's a service that an organism or an ecosystem is providing us just by its existence, essentially. It's not doing anything special for us to get that service. So the first service is just kind of a fun story. And it's about tequila. It's a fun story about tequila. So bats are the primary pollinator of agave, which is where tequila comes from. And agave is one of those really cool plants that can either reproduce sexually, like by sending up a flowering stalk, which is what these bats are flying around, or they can reproduce asexually by producing clones. Now, here's a note on clones. Clones are genetically identical to the parent. And as you reduce genetic diversity within a population, that population is now less able to handle some sort of threat to it, like a disease threat or something like that, okay? The population as a whole. So in the 1990s, agave farmers in Mexico switched from harvesting the agave after it had sent up these flowering stalks to harvesting it before it had sent up the flowering stalks. And then they were using the clones for the next year's crop, and then the next year's crop, and so on. And that reduced that genetic diversity through the population. So, you know, that decision to harvest those plants before they flowered, it was so that they could either get higher quality tequila or a larger quantity of tequila. But it did reduce the genetic diversity of the populations, and it took all the food away from bats. If there aren't flowers, there's no food for them. So in the late 1990s, there was a double whammy of disease that wiped out about a quarter of all of the agave crops in Mexico. And that was a pretty big hit because agave, tequila, that's a big crop for them. It's a lot of revenue for Mexico. And there were some bat biologists that said they're from the Tequila Interchange Project. They teamed up with some farmers, and the farmers set aside 5% of their land and let that 5% of those plants flower. And that did three different things. It provided food for the bats. It provided a way for the bats to be able to cross-pollinate these flowers and make sure that there's maintained genetic diversity within that population, which theoretically should reduce the negative effect of some sort of disease outbreak on the crops. And the third thing that it did is that it allowed those farmers to charge a little bit more for their tequila by slapping this bat-friendly sticker on it. So bats provide really important pollination services that we can benefit from. So the next ecosystem service I have is a little bit closer to home. We talked about how most bats worldwide, 70%, are insectivorous. All of the bats that we have in South Carolina eat insects. Most of the bats in the US also eat insects. We do have some nectarivores and frugivores and things like that, but most of them eat insects. So they're usually the only major predator of night flying insects, and they really like beetles and moths. And beetles and moths can be agricultural pests at some point of their life cycle. So we talked about how bats have a voracious appetite and a really fast metabolism because of flight and echolocation. Let's add something else to that. When mammals are nursing their babies, they have to constantly produce milk, and milk is also really energetically taxing. It's actually more energetically taxing than pregnancy. So you have these lactating females, these lactating female bats that can eat their body weight in insects every night. Okay. So in the southwestern United States, there are colonies called maternity colonies, which is lactating females and their pups, which are trying to grow really fast. These are the hungriest of the hungry bats. And in Bracken Cave in Texas, there is a colony of Mexican free-tailed bats. It's about 20 million Mexican free-tailed bats, that fastest flying animal on the planet. That's this species. They've got a lot going for them. But this one colony, they're estimated to eat 400,000 pounds of insects every night. 400,000 pounds every night. They're eating so many insects that they're disrupting the population cycles of cotton bollworm moths. Cotton is a major industry of that part of Texas. So this bat is providing a free pesticide service for those farmers. And there were some researchers in 2011 who said, you know, let's see if we can quantify the economic value of this free pesticide service that bats are providing us. And basically what they did is they calculated an average free pesticide service per acre in the United States, and it was averaging about $74 per acre per year. When that was extrapolated over all of the agricultural land in the United States, they found that bats are saving farmers on average about $23 billion every year in a free pesticide service. And that 23 billion doesn't include timberland. That wasn't part of their study, although bark beetles are a big problem and bats do eat beetles. It doesn't include the cost of the machinery required to put out the pesticides, the fuel, the manpower, and it definitely doesn't include mitigating downstream effects of increased pesticides on the landscape. So bats are really doing us a huge service by providing us with a pesticide service. All right, so now I've hopefully encouraged y'all to think that bats are pretty cool and really important ecologically and economically. So you might be wondering, how do we study them to make sure that their populations are being maintained at healthy levels? So we're going to talk a little bit about how to study bats. There are two major methods that I'm going to cover. One of them is through recording the bats. One of them is by having the bat in hand. They both have pros and cons. Recording bats, you get a lot of information from the bats, but you don't get very detailed information. You know nothing about each individual bat that you've recorded. All you know is species. For the bat in hand method, you get very detailed information for each individual. So you get species. You can know which individual it is if you're marking them, which we'll talk about. You can get sex, reproductive status, age, if it's an adult or juvenile, that sort of thing. So very detailed information. But bats are really hard to catch, so you don't get a lot of it on any given night. Okay, so trade-offs. So the first method I want to discuss is by recording bats, and you use these ultrasonic bat detectors. There are tons of them out there, but the one that we're going to use on Friday is this Wildlife Acoustics Echometer Touch that you can plug into your phone. The newer versions of these only work with Androids. They don't work with any iPhones anymore, which is unfortunate, but I have an old version, so I can still plug it into my iPhone. But basically, they're recording bats. And you remember how we said earlier, bats are constantly making noise because echolocation isn't a song. That works for our benefit. If a bat flies past any of these detectors, we will record it. So we take those recordings and we look at them. We make these sonograms. These are just fancier versions of what I showed you earlier. So the same thing here, it's time on the x-axis. This time it's in milliseconds. On the y-axis, it's again frequency in kilohertz. I drew a line at 35 kilohertz on both of these sonograms. So the things that we're looking for is what is the frequency of the bat. Each species has its own frequency range that it emits calls in. So that was the first thing I looked at. So I could identify, okay, this is a 35 kilohertz bat. That's narrowed down our options. Pretty much it's going to be evening bats, reds, or Seminoles, okay? And then you're gonna look at what is the slope of those calls and what is the consistency in that slope. Is it steep? Is it flat? This one is pretty straight in slope and it's consistent. The frequency jumps one up, one down, one up, one down. That's really, really telling. That's a characteristic call of evening bats. This guy over here is just a big hot mess. The kilohertz, the frequency is all over the place. The slope is all over the place, and that messy call is very characteristic of Seminole bats. So you pretty much do that. There is automated software, but it's not always accurate. So that's basically the process there. So you know the species, you don't really know anything else. Or you can do the bat in hand method, where you're essentially trying to plug up a travel corridor. So here we have a tree on one side, vegetation over here, which is the tree. We have vegetation over here, which is a bunch of shrubs. And then we have this limb that the bats are gonna have a hard time flying over. That net is pretty close to the ground, so they can't really go under it either. So hopefully by the time they have detected that net, it is too late. Unfortunately for us, bats can pick up the nets with echolocation. They can also see them, especially if it's a full moon. But these nets, we're using mist nets, M-I-S-T, and there is a net stretched between these two poles. They're very, very fine mesh when you stretch them out, but the bats can still detect these. So they're really, really hard to catch. Essentially, we are catching the ones that are not paying attention, and we're trying our best to trick them. So we use a lot of like curves. They can't see around that curve and are hopefully not paying attention. So yes, it can be very frustrating. We often catch things that are not bats, like flying squirrels, which a colleague of mine calls devils in a cute suit because they will completely destroy your nets. But we do catch a lot of flying squirrels here. But let's say that we have caught a bat and we have taken it out of the net. What's the next step? Well, we'll try to identify the species. In this case, it is a Seminole bat. It has this beautiful mahogany fur. We will identify if it's an adult or a juvenile, and we do that by looking at the wings over a light. So just like us, when bats are born, their bones are not completely fused. The finger bones do fuse within a couple of months of flying, just because flight provides a lot of pressure on those bones. The bones have to calcify to be able to withstand that pressure, especially with like torque and things like that. So here we've looked at the arrows are pointing at the same joint on two different bats. So here it's a juvenile. You've got a window in that joint and it's kind of elongated. Here is an adult, it's knobby. That's what's going on there. This is just a band here. So the adult, it's the left wing, the juvenile, it's the right wing. You've got those thumbs right there. You're also going to identify if it's male or female. These are two northern yellow bats, which are a strictly coastal species. We have them here on the coast. People love to see them. Bat biologists in the upstate hardly ever get to see yellows. But B is the second largest bat that we have on the coast. So males and females, this one's a male, and I know that just because it has the band on its right forearm. Females, we band on the left. They are like cuff bracelets, essentially, so they don't puncture that wing membrane. They do have a lip on them, so that they'll slide on the forearm, won't go over the wrist, won't go over the elbow, and they all have a unique alphanumeric code. So if we ever catch these bats again, we'll be able to know who it was, where we caught it, when we caught it, what was its weight, reproductive status, that sort of thing. If we are really interested in figuring out where that bat is going during the day, then we can put a transmitter on the bat. These transmitters have to be less than 5% of the bat's body weight. So I have one right here. It's teeny tiny. This was on a bat a couple years ago. So it's a really small transmitter. This is the transmitter part. That's the antenna. And the antenna we put so that it's running down the back of the bat and doesn't really affect the bat's flight. The transmitter itself, we kind of give the bat a haircut between its shoulder blades and then put some surgical adhesive on there. So we will, this is basically a radio frequency that we then track the bat with a receiver and try to figure out where they are in a tree. If we are successful, we'll try to find them with like spotting scope and binoculars. And so this is that bat on the previous page that we found underneath some exfoliating bark. This is a northern long-eared bat. You can see that's the band. This is a transmitter antenna. So that's its right arm, because this one was a male. That's its left arm. It's got, you can see its little wrist right there. There are some bats that roost in foliage, as we talked about. This bat actually wasn't tagged. I was looking for another bat and happened to find this one, which was pretty cool. But this is a Seminole that's basically wrapped its tail around it like a blanket when it's roosting. It's pretty cute. And then this is a colony of 4 Seminoles. They usually roost alone or in really small colonies. That's hanging out on a hickory. This is the bat that is banded. And then there are 3 other bats around it. And they often roost like this, with their heads facing each other, like they're having a little meeting, which is pretty cool to see. All right, let's talk a little bit about bats in the low country. So we have 15 different species in the low country. Before last year, we thought we had 14. There are gray bats that were found in the upstate by the state bat biologist, which is very exciting because that's another endangered species. We don't have them on the coast. They roost in caves. But we have 13 different species in Beaufort County. All of our bats eat insects, and we usually think about bats in the winter as hibernating. But our bats go through something called winter torpor, which is just like a shortened duration of inactivity. So like hibernation might last weeks to months. Torpor can last hours to days to maybe a week. But bats will be out and active at the beginning, like the early stages of a warm winter evening, essentially. You can see them flying around in January, right before the sun sets. I wanted to show y'all a few of the more common bats and bats of concern. So those foliage roosting species that we have, those would be these 3 guys here. So this is that northern yellow. They roost in the dead fronds of cabbage palmetto. Their fur is basically the same color as those dead fronds. So if you want to promote northern yellows on your property, leave those cabbage fronds that are kind of dying down. Instead of pulling them off, just leave them up there. They also roost in Spanish moss. Actually, all 3 of these roost in Spanish moss. This is a Seminole bat, which is not strictly coastal, but they are found more along the coast. As you move into the upstate, you'll see the red bat, eastern red bat. They occupy basically the same ecological niche. So there is some overlap, but we kind of go from coast to inland, Seminole bats to more red bats. And for these 2 species, their tail membrane is completely furred. So with most other bats, there's no fur on it. But I mentioned that Seminole wraps its tail around it like a blanket. And we talked about that very first bat on the first page, that scientific name, it hairy bat. They're so fluffy and furry because they are just completely exposed to the elements. In the middle of the winter, they'll still be hanging on to a pine cone. So they have to have a lot of fur to be able to handle that exposure. Went in the wrong direction. So the bats that you're more likely to find in your house, whether it's your attic or your bat house, if you put a bat house up, is going to be big browns, which is also the bat that we were listening to earlier in that video. Evening bat, which we talked about its echolocation call. And then Brazilian free-tailed bats. So this is a freetail that we actually got out of a bat house. They usually fly really, really high above the canopy, and we hardly ever catch them unless we're cheating, netting a bat house. But these are going to be the 3 species that you're most likely to see in houses or bat houses. They like tree cavities, roosting under exfoliating bark, that sort of thing. And what is your house but a big hollow tree? So they're a huge fan of that. We have some bats that are less common. This is a southeastern myotis that likes basal cavities, like tupelo and hardwoods, or likes bottomland hardwood habitat. And then this is a northern long-eared bat, which is an endangered species that we have here on the coast. And then here is a tricolored bat, which is proposed for endangered status. This is the smallest bat that we have on our coast, and it also roosts in Spanish moss. It holds onto foliage of trees, but it can also roost in culverts underneath roadways. So really, really crazy, crazy species. So these two I wanted to talk about a little bit just because they are proposed for endangered status under the Endangered Species Act. Let's talk about why. For the northern long-eared bat, we didn't know they were on the coast until 2016. We knew they were in the state. They were in the Blue Ridge in the upstate. We knew that. But in 2016, Jason Robinson, who's a colleague of mine, was netting at Palmetto Bluff, and he found northern long-eareds on the coast. That was the first documentation of long-eareds on our coast. The next year, they were finding them in Charleston County and north of Charleston County. So that was the state that confirmed it, and then some private consultants also confirmed that they were here. So under normal circumstances, this would be a huge deal because it's so far out of their historic range. But it was a particularly big deal because the year before Jason found them here at Palmetto Bluff, they were listed as threatened. They have since then been uplisted to endangered because their populations are in such severe decline. So what is going on with them? Well, it's the same thing that's going on with a lot of other bats in North America, including the tricolored bat, which is proposed for listing. And it's a disease called white nose syndrome. It's caused by the fungus Pseudogymnoascus destructans, which is another very apt scientific name. And this is a fungus that arrived in the United States from Europe. This X is where it was found in upstate New York in the winter of 2006, and it spread to a new county, at least one new county every single year since. I need to update this map, but it is now in Utah. It's in a lot more Canadian provinces than what you see here. This is from a couple years ago, but it's really devastating. It's caused huge population declines, like with northern long-eareds. They've had population declines of over 99%. There are some colonies that have 100% mortality, and if you think about that cave picture that I showed you with those little bats there's a whole bunch of them tightly clustered together in a poorly ventilated environment, which is what caves are. We learned during the pandemic that's a great way to spread a disease, and that's basically what's happening with these bats that are roosting in caves in the wintertime, which is what northern long-eareds do generally throughout most of their range. So basically what's happening is this fungus is infecting bats in caves when they're hibernating. And then the bat's immune system detects that fungus, and they emerge from hibernation to boost their body temperature so that it can fight off that infection more optimally. Higher body temperature, better way of fighting an infection. Unfortunately, the bats are hibernating for a reason. One of the reasons is that it's really cold, so you're losing energy pretty quickly, especially if you're small. The other reason is because there aren't any insects. If it's really cold and you're in the Northeast, there's no food for them. So these bats are essentially starving to death. And what's happening, I should say, like during a healthy bat during the winter will wake up a couple times from hibernation to urinate, defecate, drink some water, but they can't last multiple days at a time being woken up from hibernation. There is a silver lining here. We talked about these bats in caves, but we don't have caves on the coast of the Carolinas. And you can see that there is neither white nose syndrome nor the fungus that causes it detected along our coast. We are still swabbing for it, but we haven't found it yet. It is very likely we will get it, but we don't have it yet. And we're hopeful that even if we get the fungus, we might not get the syndrome because we don't have caves. We don't have lots of bats tightly packed together in a poorly ventilated environment. Our bats don't hibernate, they go into torpor. So they wake up pretty frequently, regularly, and that would help them fight off an infection. I'm sure y'all have noticed we have insects in the winter. You're still getting bitten by insects in the middle of January, and bats know that too. So they are foraging in the wintertime. So even if they're infected, can probably fight it off, and they won't starve to death because there's still food available for them. So there is a silver lining. We're kind of in a wait and see approach right now. We are working with the state to continue monitoring long-eared bats. So we have a very close relationship with the state bat biologists at South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. And we have only caught, I believe DNR has caught over 30 long-eared since 2016. We have only caught 6, but we have caught one 4 times. So it's not for a lack of trying. Our target is always to catch long-eared bats, but there aren't very many of them, and bats are hard to catch. So we've only caught 6 individuals, but this guy, Larry the long-eared, he's the only one we've named. We have caught 4 times, 3 of the times in the exact same spot, and we're tracking him to roosts that are in the exact same spot, which is really remarkable. So we know that we have at least a summer resident. So I know that we're over time, so I'm going to go through the last little bit kind of quickly. There are tons of threats that bats are facing today. I'm going to focus on 3 of them. So tons of threats. The first one I want to mention, I always mention it in October because this is when you see an uptick in this sort of thing. Bats are harvested for decor. They're sold as taxidermied or mummified bats, and they're often sold in shadow boxes like this one here. You can get this off of Etsy. You can get it off of Pinterest. You can go to curiosity shops. Like there's one in Savannah that I've had some words with. But they're going to tell you that they're getting their bats sourced ethically. And the people who are getting them have permits. And all of that is malarkey because this is not a regulated industry. So basically what's happening is these people, often desperate for cash, are catching lots of bats, especially if they're flying out of like a cave. And then they are killing them and then putting them in these shadow boxes. And somebody, in a kind, misguided gesture, gave me a taxidermied bat a few years ago, and it was clearly a female that had been nursing pups. And you can tell that because when the pups are suckling, the female, like the fur around the nipple is gone, and the nipple is very prominent. And so she'd been suckling a pup, and that species had twins. So that bat harvest really resulted in the death of at least 2 bats. So that's pretty sad. So if you see this, please don't buy it. If you see it on Etsy, you can actually report it now. And I've gone through and like started reporting this. So if more people report it, maybe they'll remove this. If you see it at a curiosity shop, just explain that it's not a great practice. All right, another threat is a big one. Climate change. And climate change affects bats in lots of different ways. Food, water, lots of different ways. But we're just going to focus on heat, just heat alone. So let's talk about Australia. So Australia has been having some pretty major heat waves, pretty insane heat waves over the last decade. And those heat waves are resulting in massive die-offs of bats. And a massive die-off is 1,000 or more dead bats. So in 2018, there was a heat wave that killed off about 1/3 of the spectacled flying fox population in Australia. And they're called spectacled flying foxes because they have these light rings of fur around their eyes that look kind of like spectacles. But that 1/3 of the population died off, and that wasn't even the biggest major die-off of flying foxes in Australia. So these flying foxes are being called canaries in the coal mine. So they don't seek out urban areas, but they do okay in them. They can make it in an urban area. So if these are the bats that you're seeing, because it is nearly impossible to see 1,000 or more dead, enormous bats in a city, what is happening to the bats in the eucalyptus forest that we're not seeing? So climate change, really, really big threat to bats. The last threat that I wanted to talk about is not one that was originally really obvious to me. So Merlin Tuttle is a famous bat biologist, and he was interviewed by somebody a few years ago who asked him, what is the biggest threat that bats are facing today? And I was expecting him to say climate change, habitat loss, like the big ones. But he said something that really surprised me, and he said apathy. What he actually said was apathy breeds negative opinion at best and downright harm at worst. I was thinking about, I was like, he's right, because if we hear anything about bats, is usually negative things, like all bats have rabies, or they're creepy, or they get caught in your hair, things like that. We hardly ever hear anything that is positive about them. And if we don't care about bats, then there's no incentive for environmental processes to work to help them out. We're not going to get bills passed. We're not going to have these species added to the Endangered Species Act. We won't have support when these species are added to the Endangered Species Act to keep them on that act as listed. So apathy is a really big issue for bats. And I usually use this as the kind of obligatory rabies part of the talk. I always get asked about rabies. I think what we've all heard when we were kids is that all bats have rabies, every single one of them. And the reality is that less than 1% of bats worldwide have rabies. It's a little bit higher in vampire bats because they're drinking blood. But for everything else, less than 1% of bats actually have rabies. We are more likely to come into contact with unhealthy bats, unfortunately. So if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. I mean, we're walking on the ground, they're flying in the air, and they can't take off directly from the ground. They can't land on the ground. So when we see them in the daytime, when they're mostly active at night, and on the ground where we are, they're usually not doing pretty well. So I always tell people, because I get the question, what is the most dangerous bat? I get that question a lot. And I would say a bat on the ground is the most dangerous bat. It could be totally fine. Maybe it's a pup that fell off of its mom. But usually bats on the ground aren't doing well. So you definitely don't want to pick it up. You can call DHEC. I guess DHEC isn't a thing. Are they still a thing? There's the rabies center through what I guess used to be DHEC that you can contact. And if it's dead, they'll get it and they'll process it to test it for rabies. Processing it for rabies means killing it and taking brain tissue. So just FYI on that. But definitely don't pick it up with your bare hands. Let some wildlife professional take it off your hands. And rabies, if you are bitten by a bat, I don't want to downplay the significance of that because it is 100% fatal if you don't get treatment within a certain window. The best way to avoid it is just don't pick them up. But having bats in your attic, they're not getting in your house, you're not really exposed to anything. So don't like kill them just because you're afraid of getting rabies. So we hear a lot about all bats have these diseases, and they are reservoir hosts for a lot of viruses that they don't get infected by. Rabies is actually one of the exceptions, which is really fascinating. We don't have time to get into it, but it all has to do with their evolution of flight, and it is fascinating. So they do get blamed for things like SARS outbreaks, and then people go and kill the bats, kill whole colonies of bats. And we talked about how bats have low reproductive rates. They have one pup a year. It takes a really long time to build that population back up if it has been decimated. So, we have this negative opinion that it would be great if we could, kind of turn it around. We hear a lot about bats that are creepy. We all think, we're taught vampire bats are ugly and gross. Like this guy over here is a vampire bat. And I think most people find that creepy. How many of y'all like this little guy over here in the bottom right? That's another vampire bat. That's the hairy-legged vampire bat, that little cutie right there. So just kind of thinking about changing people's perceptions of these bats. So with all those negative things that bats are facing, you have a lot of ways that you can help. You can donate to different organizations. So I listed a couple here that are really great. These two specifically work with bats. Bat Conservation International is actually based out of Austin, Texas. They do incredible work worldwide, but also in the United States. Southeastern Bat Diversity Network is our local group. The Conservancy just hosted the annual meeting this past February on Hilton Head. But you can donate to them and help them have students be able to come to their meetings and give presentations. Another great way you can help bats and tons of other species is by supporting public lands and land trusts. Being able to have land set aside for conservation purposes is one of the best ways to hit tons of different species conservation at the same time. You can do that in South Carolina by buying license plates that support wildlife. I have a Give Wildlife a Chance license plate from Georgia. So lots of different ways that you can support bats through public means. You can put a bat house in your yard if you want to attract some bats to your yard. And then you can volunteer for different organizations. So South Carolina Bat Working Group, they're looking in DNR, they're looking for volunteers year round. If you want to go out and net with them, they need the help. If you want to survey roadway culverts in the winter, especially here on the coast, let me know and I can get you in touch with the state bat biologist because they definitely need that help. And then even with bat blitzes, there's going to be a coastal bat blitz in Georgia in November. They always need volunteers. Let me know if you're interested in that. And yeah, so those great ways that you can help them, great resources. If you want to take a picture of this screen here, if you want to lose just hours of your day, check out Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation, the Smug Mug websites where a lot of the photos that if they weren't mine, they came from that website. And then you can always email me if you have bat related questions or other questions. And then our newsletter, I should have said at the top, the Conservancy, we have over 200 education events a year, and almost every single one of them is free and open to the public. So we have lots of lectures. You can also join the lectures on Zoom. You don't actually have to come here. We have some eco tours. We have like a marsh ecology event, bird walking events. You can come netting with me if you're interested. We have a Creatures of the Night program. We actually have a bat walk coming up on, I believe it's the 24th. I don't have a calendar. I believe it's the 24th for International Bat Week. So you can come out and see the bats, see us netting bats. So feel free to sign up for our newsletter or send me an email. And with that, thanks for letting me go over. I'll take some questions. Oh, that video didn't work. We'll go back a screen.
It was coming.
I don't know. I'm really bad at Zoom. Am I on or what?
Yeah, you're good. I can hear you.
Sorry. I've been doing, echo, the echo meter touch for several years now. And it's been very interesting. We also have a property down in Central America. So I bring it everywhere I go. And I travel quite a bit. So I do it down in Costa Rica. I do it here in Charleston and Pennsylvania. I did it just a few weeks ago in Virginia Beach, believe it or not. I got 4 species of bats. But I actually do get the tricolored bats right here in our backyard, along with what they call the Mexican free-tailed bats, which what you're saying is probably more the Brazilian free-tailed bat. The red, the yellow, the evening, the Seminole are the most common. Hoary bats, which I've learned actually migrate. But that being said, how accurate is the this Echo Touch bat monitor? Because from what it looks like, it doesn't really hold up to when you want to put it out on iNaturalist as an observation. It's, I want to get better at it. I feel as though I've been doing all these recordings, but I'm not really sure. I need to get to the next step. How do I get there? And how accurate is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer the second question. Well, I guess the first
Sorry,
question,
I'm
how do you
just,
get there?
my first chance. I've been doing this all by myself for all these years, so I'm really excited about it. And this first chance I've had to actually talk to somebody who knows something about this.
Yeah. So Wildlife Acoustics, which is the company that makes Echometer Touch, they are by far my favorite bat monitoring software company. They have incredible customer service. I've been on the phone with them for an hour.
You call them and you end up, you actually get the designer of the software, and
they're incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so they have tons of like if you go to their resources on their website, they have some resources that can help you with training to learn a little bit more about how to identify the calls. But the best way that I suggest improving that skill is by going to one of their workshops. The workshops are pricey, but for me, it was one of the best ways that I had of learning how to look at these acoustic calls. So like my master's project was using acoustics. Actually, Kaka was one of one of my study sites. But yeah, so acoustics I used not kaleidoscope, which is what Wildlife Acoustics comes up with, an old school version that's not, I don't suggest anymore. And then for further graduate work, I use
Kaleidoscope
Kaleidoscope Pro.
is like a website that allows you to organize the files.
So it's the software. So you know the software on your phone that is identifying everything for you, that's Kaleidoscope. But what you're getting with the Echometer Touch is a different version of Kaleidoscope where you're just getting the auto ID essentially. If you were to put up any of those other detectors that I showed you that are like research grade detectors, you then download those calls, you run it through Kaleidoscope Pro, which does automatic identification, but then you manually vet a certain subset of those calls based on whatever your research question is. And then you manually vet every single tricolored call because they're a species of concern. It's usually what people are interested in. Hoary bats, because they will be a species of concern within the next decade because they're being hard hit by wind turbines. Silver hairs for the same reason. Eastern reds for the same reason. And then any of the myota species, you manually vet all of those. So the best way to do that is to go to a training place. The software, to answer your question about how accurate it is. The reason why it's not holding up on iNaturalist is because you can't guarantee it's not that accurate, the automatic ID, depending on certain species, depending on where you're setting up that detector, the setup is incredibly important. So if you're putting it in your yard and it's facing a water source, those aren't good calls. There's going to be fractured calls in there. They're really hard to ID. If you're putting it in front of vegetation, same thing, fractured calls. You're not going to get good quality calls. Over an open field, something like that, you'll get much better calls. That auto ID will be a lot more accurate. But yeah, usually iNaturalist, somebody's going to flag that and say, I don't believe it. Especially when Kaleidoscope is trying to tell Seminole bats and red bats apart, it's impossible. And the software insists on doing it. You can't tell them apart acoustically. So yeah, it's that, yeah. I guess that's my answer for that.
Thank you. My last question is, when will they come out with like a sonogram ID book for bats? Could there be such a thing?
Sonogram ID book, you mean like, I'm not
Kind
sure
of
I
like,
understand.
well, there's sonograms for birds. Could there be something for bats, or is it too difficult because bats have different it changes as the bat approaches their prey, their call changes, or and they may sound like another bat.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's because they are constantly changing their calls based on not just what vegetation is around them, but what other bats are around them. If you have two tricoloreds calling in the same place and you picked up both of them, they're not at the same frequency because they'd be picking up the other bat's call. They also change their calls if they're moving into clutter. So you have open calls and you have clutter calls. And those open calls are lower in frequency, even within the same species, lower in frequency, farther apart. The clutter calls higher in frequency, that slope is pretty steep. It's so hard to tell them apart. It really is. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have time maybe for a couple of quick questions, although there were some in the chat. Let's see, some of them were, can you use bait for moths to like you do for moths with UV light? And then sometimes people actually they may play bird songs to attract birds into their nest nets. I have heard of that. Anything like that for bats?
Oh my goodness, that's a great question. So I'll answer the netting one first. There are some people who swear that acoustic lures is what they call it, that acoustic lures work with bats. I am skeptical because it has not worked when I've been out with one of those people who claimed that it works amazing. I do think it's species specific. So for example, bonneted bats, Florida bonneted bats, which we don't have in South Carolina, that does seem to work for them. They have, they've put these nets in just big open fields. There's no flyway that you're funneling the bats through. And if I were to do that here, I would catch 0 bats because they can see that net. But with the Florida bonneted bats, they've put acoustic lures, which are distress calls of other bats. If you think about birds, that flocking behavior they get when one species has a distress call, like there's a snake there and they're all coming up to check it out, that mobbing behavior. Bats are doing the same thing. They're really curious. They want to know, what are you yelling at? And it will attract different bats. I will say, having said that, I don't believe the lures work. I have been taking a bat out of the net that is, the bat's freaking out and yelling at me. And there is another bat that hits directly above my head. And I know, like, I have a light on, it could see the net. It was just checking out, what is this guy yelling about? So I do think that it happens sometimes. I also think that if you leave that lure out for an extended period of time, the bats become used to it. So there's been a couple papers that have said that as well, and I completely agree with that. For luring them to, I get a question a lot about luring them to bat houses. You like bringing in bat guano isn't going to lure any bats to the bat house. Putting moths there isn't going to lure anything. They're picking up on motion. And then if you see bats around or street lights where there's lots of insect activity, you often see bats there. You used to see that a lot more than you see now, just because there aren't as many insects as there used to be. But you'll often see bats just kind of hanging out around a street lamp and a bit in like an open area, like a parking lot or something. And that's the bats coming to the moths that are attracted to the lights. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, is like we set up for moths recently, and if you put a mist net somewhere where they would come, where you're attracting the moths, I thought maybe that would sneak them in.
Yeah, I have. So on our Creatures of the Night program, we do put out a black light on a sheet. And it's usually not very far from the nets, but I haven't, just anecdotally, I haven't noticed an uptick. And we do, so this time of year, so I would say, I guess, middle of summer through now, we get a lot of silk moths emerging. So we mostly get imperial moths here. Sometimes we'll get the occasional Luna, and like if we're lucky, we'll get a royal walnut or a polyphemus. We hardly ever get those. But the imperial moths are just hanging out in the net and they're huge. And I haven't noticed bats going after them, with one exception, and it was a juvenile big brown. And I have to think that it saw the net and thought, like, this is my lucky night. Like, I'm gonna be so full. And it was in the net right next to the moth. I don't know which one hit first. But sometimes we'll leave the moths in and just see, maybe this will work out. I don't know. But again, anecdotally, I haven't noticed a pattern. That is a good idea though. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Christina, did you have something? No? Okay. Any other questions there? All right. Well, Lydia, thank you very much. And folks, remember the Friday event is full. So if you're not going to be able to make it, there is a waiting list. So please let Nikki know. And she also mentioned in the chat earlier that she will be sending out some more details about what to meet. And Lydia, I don't know if you've got any suggestions for us other than, come prepared for night in the woods with bugs.
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing, I don't know what the temperature is going to be like, but closed-toed shoes I'd suggest, because you never know. And bring a light of some sort. It doesn't have to be a red light. It can be big old flashlight if you want, or a headlamp, or if you want to be able to use your hands, whatever you want. We'll have an echometer touch. Well, we'll probably have two. I just need to check on an iPad, whether it works or not still. And then, yeah, so we'll have an echometer touch, and we'll talk a little bit about bats roosting. And I can give a little bit more details about things that I found out specifically about Kaka when I was recording bats there. And the colony of rafts that used to be, or maybe still is, in the dog kennel, I'm not sure, but really incredible, incredible that they were there. So yeah, but I think that's pretty much it. Closed-toed shoes, I would suggest long pants, but not necessary. Something to stay warm in, you know, typical field stuff.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks, folks. And we will see you all soon.
Yeah, thanks all. Thank you all.